In tonight's first pre-election segment, we turn to the race for U.S. Representative in the 7th Congressional District. In Boston, the district includes Allston-Brighton, the Back Bay, Fenway, South End, East Boston, Charlestown, Hyde Park, and Mattapan, along with most of Roxbury and Dorchester and part of Jamaica Plain. Tonight, we'd like to welcome the incumbent seeking re-election in the Democratic primary on September 4th, Mike Capuano. Thank you very much for being with us.
Happy to.
In this race, we've heard a lot about you and your challenger being pretty much in sync on how you'd actually vote if you're in Congress. But talk about things that reflect something beyond that. Look at the health centers that were built in Boston over the last 10 years.
Voting on the floor of the House is an important part of what we do. It is not even close to the only part of what we do. It has, on a time aspect, is probably not much time spent doing that overall. But what we do is we, number one, prepare to be able to vote in the House. Number two, once a law is passed or a regulation is passed, part of our job is to also make it work for our district, to make sure that the right regulations get passed and then to make it work for our district. So, for instance, the community health centers, first of all, I started the Community Health Center Caucus because it keeps attention to the matter. It allows other members of Congress to express their support for CHCs. That's number one. Number two is then you advocate for money for them, both in the health care bill, which we did. There was separate money directly targeting for the community health centers to the tune of billions of dollars, and this is across the country, not just in this district. And then once things like that get passed, and the stimulus the same way, there was separate money in the stimulus directly for community health centers. If you're good at your job, you can try to get some of that for my district. In theory, every penny of those dollars would have been spent on community health centers, but they wouldn't have necessarily been spent here. There are many community health centers across the country, and they could have been spent in Baltimore or Los Angeles or Chicago or any number of places. We got an awful lot here to rebuild pretty much every single community health center in the district. That's maybe a little more than what we did, but most of them, if not all of them.
One example of a bill, well, it's not even a bill, but certainly one thing that sets you apart from your rival here is what to do about the chief federal immigration enforcement agency, ICE. She wants to abolish it altogether. What do you think should be done?
I voted against the creation of ICE and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security because at the time I thought it was simply moving the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. I still believe that. An organizational chart is important, but it's really not the most important. The most important thing of what are the policies they're putting together. I never thought I'd be in a country where the official policy of the White House was to separate infants from their mothers. That still shocks me even just saying this. That's what I've been focused on, the policy on temporary protective status, the policy of reuniting families, or whatever the issue might be on immigration. That's the most important thing. And I draw the analogy, if you don't like the speed limit on your street, you don't advocate for getting rid of the police department. You advocate for changing the speed limit and having the police enforce the appropriate law. But if the police are told they have to enforce a speed limit of 10 and you think it should be 20, the best way to go about doing it is not to complain to the police who are doing their job. It is to then go to the city council and say, we need to increase the speed limit to 20 or whatever it might be. So for me, it's the same thing. I am not a supporter of ICE. As I said, I voted against Department of Homeland Security, the creation of it. But once it's created, that's a table of organization. Again, I don't want to say it's not important. It is. But the most important thing are the policies they enforce, not where they are on a chart. Let's not forget, before ICE, there was the INS. Some people advocated to get rid of them. After ICE, someone will enforce the law, no matter what laws you think. If you and I could sit and come up with the perfect immigration law, whatever it might be, there would still be some limitations. And if there are any limitations on it, unless you have open borders, then somebody has to enforce those limitations, and you can call the agency whatever you want. It's the policies that matter, not the organizational table.
What about the vote on what's called the Blue Lives Matter bill, basically treating assaults and other kinds of violence against police as a federal offense? We have tough laws for that already, so why vote for that?
The bill, it's a federal thing, not a local thing. All this bill did was basically make it a specific crime to specifically target police officers and correctional officers. You're right, it is already a crime, but that's like saying we shouldn't have done civil rights bills. If you attack someone who's a black person, you have two different crimes potentially.
But you're really saying that civil rights bills that were passed by the federal government are no more consequential than that?
No. Because there were people who were not doing it. In this particular case, it's just as important to say that if you go out of your way to target a police officer, to target a correctional officer, not just killed him in the commission of another crime. But go out of your way to target it. And we've had that happen in Massachusetts just recently. In Yarmouth, I think it was, and maybe Falmouth. We've had police officers killed who were targeted just across the river after the explosion at the marathon, at the marathon bombing. We had a police officer at MIT who was intentionally targeted because he was a police officer. And to me, I would argue that, first of all, the murder is a crime in and of itself. But second of all, targeting a police officer is also an additional crime. And it may not have a whole lot of substantive effect. I never suggested that it did. But when the bill comes to the floor that says it is a specific crime to target police officers and correctional officers, I don't see any problem with that. You could argue, as my opponent has done, well, the bill should have done more. I would agree with that. But you have certain amendments. At some point, you have to say yes or no. That bill, as a standalone bill, was okay. And I was okay. It was a good bill as far as I'm concerned. Could it have done more? Of course it could do more. But what it did was fine. I don't see a single argument against it.
We have an increasing divide in this country by income. We're more racially polarized as well. Looking at this district you represent, how would you like to address that? What's your main priority for addressing that?
Well, on the federal level, I think the most important thing we can do is change our tax policy. That's number one. We just did the biggest tax bill in maybe ever, but certainly in memory, and almost all of the tax cuts went to the wealthiest people in the society. That was 100% wrong. First, I wouldn't have voted for it no matter how you look at it, but if we were going to give away a couple of $1 trillion, it should have been targeted towards the poor and the working class in order to boost up the economy. They certainly would spend it on something to help the economy going together. That's number one. But it's not just that. It's also providing federal money for housing projects, for housing development, for senior housing. I mean, those things depend on federal dollars. For health care. Again, who goes without health care? It's not the rich people. It's poor and working class poor. When you provide health care for everybody through Obamacare or any other process, Medicare, Medicaid, those are social programs where we provide health care. We always subsidize health care. People do pay for it, but we subsidize it because there's a social good to it. And that helps narrow the income gap. Can you imagine how much worse it would be if they repealed Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid? It's already a gap, and it is a growing gap because of the policies that have been coming out of Washington. Can you imagine how much worse it would be if Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security were gone? And I'm just using those as examples. So I would argue there are many things we could be doing. For a long time, the federal government did do it. In the last 20 years or so, that has not been the case. The federal government has been retreating from that.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with candidate for re-election, Congressman Mike Capuano. Congressman, I know there's been debate in this race about what difference it makes whether you're male or female or a person of color or white, but if you look at some of the recent elections around the country, this blue tide going back, starting with the Women's March, doesn't it make a difference who you are and where you come from?
Don't know. I was raised to believe that it shouldn't. Having been born and raised in Somerville, a lot of people in the greater Boston area looked down their nose at us and figured everybody from Somerville was a criminal, and everybody from Somerville was stupid, and everybody from Somerville was not a worthwhile person. And we weren't unique. They felt that way about many parts of Boston. Even within Boston, there were parts of Boston that some people still do look down their nose on. I think the worst thing you can do is judge somebody by the zip code they come from, or their race, or their gender identity. I would argue that you should be judging people for who they are, not what they are. And I know that some people don't agree with that, and I know that some people don't think that's a worthwhile goal. I respectfully and strongly disagree. The goal is to judge people based on who they are, not what they are.
But this is a party that also needs to energize people and get some crossovers. You want to overthrow the Trump regime here, so isn't that important?
Yes, very much so. How does any of that play into it? I mean, Trump's agenda hurts everybody. And by the way, in this particular district, there is a majority of no one. There is no majority race or ethnicity or religion or any of those things. Anybody who sits in this congressional seat has to be able to work with people that don't look like them, don't worship like them, don't think like them, and have to be able to work together and cooperatively and positively to actually come up with a coalition of approach towards federal issues. In the last many years, I believe my record proves that I'm able to do that.
I want to ask you about your thinking on President Trump, whether he should be impeached. Last year, you were still holding out for more information. Where are you now?
Here's what I want. I want Congress to do its job, to have hearings, to do this. I would not convict anyone on the basis of media reports. However, let's be honest, the media reports, if they don't concern you, I don't think you're reading them. They concern me deeply. I'm not saying I don't believe them. I kind of do, but they're still media reports. You don't go to trial, and this would be a trial, on the basis of media reports. Media reports can start it, and I think Congress should be doing its job, in this particular case, having the hearings and doing the research and the investigations, whether we should have an impeachment. That's what I support. Personally, I would suspect that they would find many different reasons to impeach this president. But again, I personally would not do that. I would not do to Donald Trump what he would do to somebody else, which is to impeach them on the basis of an emotional reaction.
If Democrats succeed in becoming a majority in the House, at least, what would you like to see for leadership in the House?
I want leadership that is strong, that understands how to fight the Trump agenda, how to move our agenda forward, and bring Democrats together. It's a tall order, and it's difficult to do. Democrats are notorious for not being well organized. The old Will Rogers, even I'm not a member of anything organized, I'm a Democrat. That's true. It's still true today. So for me, that's the most important part: being able to bring people together in leadership and move us forward in a unified way.
Well, if you have the opportunity, you certainly have the seniority, what would you like to do? If you get to a new committee or something like that, you're chairing something, what would you like to do?
If I went to a new committee, I'd have to start at the bottom, which would give me virtually no influence on that committee. The two committees I'm on are financial services that most importantly deals with housing issues, all housing issues, mortgages, rents, federal investment, and the other committee I'm on is transportation infrastructure, which does just that. Subways, airports, boats, everything. They deal with everything with transportation and infrastructure. Both of those committees, I'm a very senior person on both of those committees. I hope that they will both be incredibly active, getting the federal government to reinvest in housing. My mother lived in senior housing. I know how important it was to her. And I hate the idea that the federal government is slowly walking away from it and has almost walked away from reinvesting in it, upgrading it, making it better, because a lot of these buildings are older. And that's just one aspect. On transportation, in Boston, roads aren't going to get us where we need to go. We need more and better subways. We need more and better bus rapid transit. Any way we can move people from point A to point B will both help transportation and commute times, which is important, and help the housing crisis, because if people can get from point A to point B, they can expand their view of where they might want to live.
You mentioned transportation. One unusual thing you did last year, you used some of your own campaign money to provide free rides on the Fairmount Indigo line. What was the purpose?
That line, I worked very, very hard to get that line back up and running. I mean, it was running, but it was running very poorly, very inconsistently. Only had a couple of stops. I worked with Deval Patrick mostly to add 6 new stops, to upgrade the stops that we did have, to improve the service. And I had a fight to make sure that it was consistent service, because it was inconsistent, but it is now consistent. And in order to fight to get more money for that line, because that line's more like a subway line than a commuter rail line, in order to do that, the ridership has to I have to be able to justify it, to say, if you do this, look at all the people you're serving. And the idea was to try to boost ridership that would then strengthen my arguments with the state and federal government to say, we really need to invest even more in this line, because look at what happened to ridership. It has gone up. We still need to do more work on that.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Candidate for re-election in the 7th Congressional District, Mike Capuano.